Mikey Kay is an investigative journalist and a former RAF pilot. Mikey is joining us live from Paris. Welcome to WION, Mikey, and it's good to see you. I'll start by asking you, Ukraine is facing a huge burden economically. Will it recover even after a truce is announced? And what impact does this conflict pose to the world?
Morning, Eric. And well, any conflict of any type will have a massive economic impact on any economy. That's certain. But what I'd like to do is just pick up on the previous conversation on the political actions that you were having with Rosie. And there were two other massive considerations that I'd just like to bring to the fore. The first one is there's a lot of conversation about sanctions. You talked about the economy of Ukraine. Certainly the sanctions on Russia will impact their economy. But there's also the UN. And people aren't talking about UN Security Council resolutions. And I think one of the big things that could happen right now politically is that the US, the UK and its allies could draft the United Nations Security Council resolution, and they could bring that to the vote. Now, we know Russia's going to vote that down. China will probably abstain. But there are 10 other members, non-permanent members on the Security Council. They've got the vote. You'll see the UK, the US and France will vote yes. And then you'll look at what the terms are for the responses from the General Assembly. And I think it's hugely important to articulate and to formalize right now what the views are of the United States, the General Assembly, the non-permanent members of the Security Council, and get that annotated in history just so Putin knows how much of the world are against his actions. The second consideration is, how does the US implement military activity in Ukraine should it wish to do so? Now, the authorization for the use of military force in 2001 and 2002 has been the precedent for most of US's military activity in Syria and Iraq and Yemen, etc. But I'm not convinced that any action in Ukraine would fall under that, which would mean that it would need a vote on Congress from the House and from the Senate. So there are two considerations when it comes to the political components. When we're going back to the military component now, this is fascinating because Kyiv is obviously under threat. The capital's under threat. And while Russia has air superiority, and while it's got superiority of boots on the ground, and there are no other boots on the ground, conventional boots on the ground in Ukraine, apart from Ukrainian forces, then Kyiv is going to be on the back foot. And they're the decisions in terms of deterring and preventing and disrupting the air component. And once you do that, you can then start targeting the ground component. So they're the big considerations that I think are very important to get their head around NATO and its allies in the next 48 hours.
Mikey, despite the issuance of sanctions, is there a possibility to mend the hostilities at this moment? What are the options left to save Ukraine?
Well, we know that the Kremlin spokesman Peskov is already offering the Ukrainian government, Zelensky, a way out through terms, what they're calling terms of surrender. This, to me, is an indication of vulnerability from Russia. We talked about the sanctions, but even before these sanctions were imposed, Russia's economy was hurting. The ruble, the currency, has tanked. Oil's tanked over the last 10 years, although it's coming back at the moment. It's now at $100 a barrel and over. But in the last 10 years, the economy of Russia has taken a serious hit. And what that means militarily is that it does not want any prolonged conflict. Now, Petraeus doctrine, clear, hold, build. What we're looking at the moment is the clearing bit. Russia coming in, trying to clear out Ukraine. It's the hold bit where things get really nasty. And as soon as Russia decides to put a flag in the sand inside Kyiv, that's when it gets nasty. And what I'm talking about by nasty is not conventional warfare, but unconventional warfare. The asymmetric warfare, the type of warfare that we've seen in Syria, the type of warfare that we've seen in Iraq, the type that Russia experienced in 1994 in Chechnya, which caused them to withdraw. And asymmetric warfare isn't about conventional troops. It's about militants. It's about special forces. It's about IEDs. It's about mines. And we all know from experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, IEDs crippled the conventional component of NATO forces in that country. And that could well happen to Russia. So Russia won't want to prolong anything going on inside of Ukraine. They'll want a quick resolution to this.
Mikey, finally, before I let you go, what should we expect in the long run?
I think in the long run, what you'll see is the hybridization of warfare. Now Putin has become very adept to the hybridization of warfare because, as we all know, Russia entered Syria in 2015 by the invitation of Assad. and they've been conducting a lot of hybridized warfare against hybridized targets. Russia has also used hybridized warfare to secure Crimea as well. So what we'll see is this evolution. I don't think there's any appetite for the US to put boots on the ground, but the US, mark my words, will be developing and involving relationships with potential partners on the ground that US and its NATO allies won't be obliged to talk about in the media, which means it's not conventional, it'll be unconventional. So I would suggest you'll see more activity from the likes of the CIA.
Right.
The Stinger missile situation is fascinating at the moment because the Stinger missile, man-portable air defense launched missile system, has the ability to disrupt Russia in a significant way. It happened in the 80s when the Soviets were in Afghanistan. The CIA funneled Stingers through the Pakistan ISI, the intelligence community, into the Mujahideen. And that took, Russia's air assets took a massive hit on that. So I think air superiority, how can you disrupt that? They're the big decisions that are going to be happening at the moment, but I don't think you'll see boots on the ground anytime soon.
Mikey Kaye, thank you very much for your time and your insights and for talking to WION today.
Pleasure.
Moving on, after weeks of failed diplomacy, Ukraine is now under full-fledged Russian attack, with tensions running high over the well-being and safety of Ukrainians living in the conflict-ridden region. The ground-level situation in the country continues to remain grim. Thousands of Ukrainians have started to flee their country over fears of attacks from Russian troops. Videos and photos on social media show lines of cars moving out of Kyiv to take refuge in neighboring European countries. United Nations has called on European countries to keep their borders open for those fleeing the violence. Now, according to the UN Refugee Agency, around 100,000 people have already fled their homes within Ukraine, while thousands more have taken shelter in neighboring countries of Poland and Hungary. Poland has said that it will open 9 reception centers along its 535-kilometer-long border with Ukraine. The reception centers will offer meals and medical care to the refugees arriving in the country. A scheduled train from Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine arrived on Thursday in a Polish town, carrying a few hundred passengers. Now, according to border authorities, some 15,000 people have already crossed the border to Poland since the invasion.
We've actually been very lucky to get out of Ukraine with the second to last train that was coming here. We've spent last 16 hours using all of our luck coming here. Many people, many of our friends will get refugee status, but we are fortunate enough to have our accommodation planned. And we are very happy that we have our friends in Poland that are ready to help our people.
Meanwhile, at Luzhanka border crossing, which connects Hungary and with Ukraine, hundreds of cars waited in a queue to cross the border. Hungarian authorities have said that they are sending troops to the border to deal with refugee influx. Sounds of sirens and missiles were heard all through the day in Ukrainian cities as residents scrambled to take shelter in underground subway stations. 2 loud blasts were reported in central Kyiv earlier today as Russian troops inch closer to the Ukrainian capital. Ukraine's army has accused Russia of firing Kyiv's civilian areas with ballistic missiles. Meanwhile, in the neighboring city of Mariupol, houses were on fire and buildings were damaged as Russian troops launched extensive missile attacks across the region. Residents in Donbas region, which is controlled by Russian-backed separatists, has also reported a massive upsurge of air attacks since Thursday, with multiple buildings being destroyed and dozens of lives lost. Residents are now ramping efforts to evacuate the region. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.